Thank you very much, Alyssa. That was really a very good, I think, vignette from your dissertation. So it opens up windows on the whole this project in a nice way. So questions? Yes, Marcus. Okay, why don't we go around this way again? The anti-clockwise had it yesterday, so the clockwise.
Okay, yeah, whatever it is. And then, yeah. I just follow the rule blindly. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for this. Is anything lost when describing one of the points that you are making in something like the following way? So I agree with so many things, even though I might use some of the terms differently, but that probably doesn't matter. So I'm wondering about something like take the crying case. I think you made a wonderful case, and everything of course depends on how to describe the case. And I think that any description would lose the game that denied the evidence, which also sometimes happens in discourses of this form. No, this is not even an apt description. This is not even a fact. But so are you saying, or is the relativist, as you portray her, saying that in a certain sense, there are no cryings? So one way of looking at it would be to say there are cryings, and people react differently to cryings. So there are events, cryings, and the relativism consists in different ways of relating to a certain type of event. Another way of looking at this would be to say that what is specific about, at the very least, human culture, and we leave it open whether this is a deeper biological phenomenon, but at least human culture has the following feature: there are no crying. So some human actions have such an ontological shape. So would this be compatible with what you're saying? Would this be an adequate point to take home? Yeah, and then this would really hold across the board, because you started out with something I think very important, that you don't have to travel to Ecuador to make the point. So the relativism would also be culture immanent. So it wouldn't be so much, usually we tend to individuate culture. It's hard how to individuate them. Sometimes we do it via nationalities, but that doesn't work also in that case. Sometimes we do it regionally, but it's certainly not geographical. But this might give you a criterion. So you move from one culture to the next when you notice that this is that type of crying. So say your crying or my crying would be a crying for help, and the other crying would be a crying, however you want to characterize it, and then you would have to ask the anthropologist about this. Is this a fair way of putting it?
Well, it's a good question, and there are actually a lot of parts in what you're saying. So I hope I respond to enough of them. As far as the last part about what you were saying, does seeing that maybe they're different acts, or we might call them different things, does that help us individuate different cultures? I think in one sense, yes. It's when we're focused on some sort of example, and we realize that, and we feel that distance. So sometimes we encounter something that you weren't expecting, causes you to stop back and look, and it starts pushing you towards a relativist account. But what I think the bigger point that we're dancing up against here is, it's one that's been going around the room all day, and probably yesterday too, I think. And I certainly had it in mind during Michael's talk with when we say, one says P and the other says not P, and then we listen well to the relativist, or at least someone coming from the sort of cultural perspective that I am, then we start wondering, is it not just one saying P for me, the other saying not P for me, but maybe one saying P for me, P for me is true for me, and the other one saying not P for me is not true for me. And then we get these worries. I know something Michael's probably already ready to ask me about, because he always does. We've been talking about this for years, is in what sense then is there a conflict, if it's a P for me and a P for you. So I do think, so I don't know if that's the worry that you were getting at, that in some way, this might help us to individuate cultural lines, but it might also pose a problem for the relativists, because then are we really talking about the same thing? What sort of disagreement do we have? Is that also where you were
In
going?
a certain sense, it would not be a point about disagreement that much. It would be a point about the facts.
Yeah.
You know, so someone is crying, you might think that, here are two things. You know, the baby's crying, I'm crying.
Yeah.
But already on that level, if I'm crying and the baby's crying, you might say it's the same thing.
Right.
You know, salty water is coming out of their eyes.
Right, and we're not going to have any clear standards that are going to tell us at what point is this the same thing.
Exactly.
At what point is this a different thing. That itself is going to be a sort of like a distinction that we're going to have to make in the moment, in the context of that discussion, which is what I think happens. I can continue to answer the other part of that question, or we can go on. We can move on. Okay, I saw a lot of hands. We'll talk. And maybe someone else is going to ask me about that anyway.
Thank you, Alyssa. That was very interesting. Just a suggestion about this nice idea that we get to the other viewpoint without stepping outside our own, but sort of by analogy. It seemed to me that one of the ideas that might fit in very nicely there is this idea that some people, including my Cambridge colleague Jane Heal, have about folk psychology, that I think it's called the so-called simulation theory. So the idea is in making making sort of intentional folk psychological ascriptions to other people. What we're relying on is an imaginative ability we have to put ourselves in other people's shoes.
Yeah, sort of empathic.
Now, if you're attracted to that view and attracted to the idea that it's a very basic sort of capacity, then it's not unnatural to think that it's much more basic than the particular configurations that we happen to find in particular human societies. And so it's not really surprising that it should be possible to use it to, as it were, put ourselves in shoes which are well beyond our own particular configuration.
Yeah, and I think that this is an important aspect of what goes on in the experience of deep engagement. I talk about some other features that I didn't get into here today, but I think it's a really important aspect, and it's not something that only happens in cross-cultural encounters, but it plays a really important role there. And thank you for the suggestion.
And one way to sort of to get some traction on whether that was a helpful idea, I think, would be to think about, well, I mean, if that was the case, if that was playing a crucial role, then you might expect that once you got beyond human cultures, once you got beyond the realm where there was some plausibility to the idea that there was this capacity that we all humans all have, then suddenly the idea that analogy and so on might help you would kind of fail.
Well, I guess I guess that we find it attenuating itself by degrees as we move away. But maybe it doesn't. I would want to say it doesn't disappear, but maybe it attenuates or requires a much more creative and difficult sort of connection. But thank you for the suggestion.
I was having some of the same thoughts that Marcos was already mentioning. Let me just really briefly put it another way, though. Presumably, your main point isn't that moral evaluation or evaluation of action in general has to be sensitive to the particular features of a concrete situation. I mean, that someone like Aristotle would agree with that, and hasn't traditionally been thought of as a relativist. So what would somebody who responded to your example by saying that that's all it shows,
Aristotle?
what would they be missing about multiplicity of
well, I mean, I don't.
conflicting perspectives?
So, I don't take it to be something that establishes relativism. I take it to be something that helps us to understand how the relativist can give her account of another way of life, without showing that that there's only one worldview and there's only one set of conclusions of what's right or wrong. I've actually had some Aristotelians come up to me and tell me what sort of relativistic sympathies they have and how they find roots of relativism in Aristotle. So I think, I think it wouldn't hurt the project as far as like the sort of argument that I was giving. But if you think there's something else, feel free to respond back.
I'll have to think about it.
Okay, we can talk about it later.
Yeah.
This is very nice.
Oh, thank you.
One quibble about whether, to some extent, you invoke some common ground even when you try to make sense of what was going on. So, for example, in the description of the personal space, but in the creation of, okay, this is now bedtime. So now, aren't you invoking in your own terms, right? What is it, that experience where you're about to sleep, and what that space invokes? And to some extent, and I take it that you're describing accurately what's going on there in the community. Isn't that enough to say, look, there is some common ground?
So I don't want to, I mean, I think David and I agree here. I don't want to deny all sort of common ground. But, and I think it's from some sort of experience of common ground that we understand difference. I hope I'm not attributing something to you that you won't agree with. So it's right that we have some sort of common ground, but we don't access that by going into some sort of neutral space. I mean, that's what I want to say. So that has to do with my comments about, well, you know, we construct even this common ground from our own sort of experience. And my sense is that when the Chachi look for common ground to try to understand us, they're going to reach for they're going to employ a different toolkit. And then what I also want to say, so I want to say that, look, when we don't step onto, we don't do it from outside our own experience, we don't do it on some sort of absolute ground, and the sort of common ground that we use, it's rooted back to our own concepts and experience, and whatever sort of universal features it has doesn't allow us to resolve conflict non-relativistically. So since I'm using this definition of entrenched conflict, the one thing that I want to preserve for the relativist case is the inability to resolve conflict on non-relative ground. Although interestingly, the relativist does resolve conflict sometimes on relative ground, which is a sort of relativistic dissolution of conflict. What we were talking about yesterday, effervescent, what did someone else refer to as evaporative? Yeah, so it's that sort of thing. So there is a relativistic dissolution of conflict, which I think is sort of part of what your example was pointing towards. But the one thing that I want to avoid, because it's what I take to be the defining feature of the sort of phenomenon that the cultural relativist is concerned with, is the inability to resolve these entrenched conflicts on non-relative ground.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Alyssa. There's clearly a lot that I'm sympathetic to there. I think this conversation up to this point has been helpful. I was wondering why you wanted to insist that the context is not fully separable from the insight. But I think it does have to do with your wanting to say that the insight is not reached from some neutral standpoint that's available to us all in principle. But is it okay to put in this way that somehow the understanding we reach is path dependent? So it depends on where we're starting. We find a way to connect with the other from where we are, which we can't guarantee is going to be available to somebody else. And so that understanding is going to be particular and not necessarily universalizable. And in the same way with negotiation, if you reach some kind of understanding with the other, it's not like you're pulling out the universal blueprint and finding it there. It's that from where you are and your kind of very contingent understanding of where the other is, you find some way to bridge the difference. But again, it's not guaranteed to be universal. It's not proof of some kind of universal. But again, it's a path-dependent.
This is a good question. This is something Michael and I have been talking about too. And I mean, I think here when I was concerned to answer the universalists and the absolutists, the one thing that I really wanted to insist on was that you can't take these accounts and abstract away completely from the experience of deep engagement to analyze them. Or if you do, you're just misreading the relativists, and that's why she starts to look incoherent when you take into account this sort of path that you're talking about, you understand that it's not like we went to some absolute space, it's not like we uncovered these grand universals that are going to resolve all of our conflict. So that's the point that I really want to emphasize. And then these other questions of what path gets us there and how does the path work are really rich questions to explore. And I have to think more about, because Michael was pushing me on this the other day too. He's like, so you build a ladder up to another way of life. You kick it away, aren't you as good as in that other way of life? And here I almost went quite that as far, but I didn't. I said, it's an experience, it's not an experience of the Chachi, it's an experience of Alyssa as the Chachi. So it's a great question. I think there are a lot more issues to resolve there.
Yeah, I think there's something in what you just said. That,
Yeah.
the ladder is, you can't kick it away just...
Yeah, Michael thinks that you can, and so we've had a lot of discussions about this.
Michael?
Just to say, I thought this was a wonderful example, a very rich suggestive treatment of that example.
Thank you.
Yes, right. And particularly your emphasis on the transformative feature to the inquirer. And that's often an ignored feature.
Yeah.
That I think is terrific that you really do emphasize that. I would like to see some serious work on the transformation of the inquirer.
Thank you. So I think we're ready for a short break.
Well, maybe actually, I think we're actually
Michael's
not at all
next.
short of time.
Michael's next, but we just have to take down the
I have my ladder
equipment.
still. I want not to throw my ladder
sorry.
at you. So.
Oh, throw your ladder at me. I'm sorry. I was getting rid of you.
I mean, this is very closely related to David's question. I think it may even be the same question in the end. But to sort of begin at the beginning in a way, let's use your hut as a metaphor, right? You've got your elevated.
It's a bamboo
hut.
ladder then.
And let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, that the way that the Chachi get in and out is not by climbing a ladder or something, but by coming from a cliff. They descend from a cliff or something. And this is a sort of metaphor for how they reach their understanding of their own concepts, they reach their own values, and what have you. This attitude to crying and so on and so forth. And so they did it by being born into the culture, being raised in certain ways, introduced to certain linguistic practices, punished for this, rewarded for that. And all of this, the way we grow up and learn these things, our concepts, our beliefs, our values, and so forth. Now, the metaphor continues. So the anthropologist comes and he's into ladders, right? So he puts a ladder up to the hut at the other end, where there actually, I think, was one in your picture. And let's suppose, this is sort of a metaphor for his bridging mechanisms, the ones you were describing, right? We have an idea of private space, and so we can use that as a kind of analogy to understand this attitude of reticence about expressing emotions and what have you. It's a kind of analogy we use in order to penetrate that practice. Or perhaps a linguistic case. We have our own language with its own concepts. We have rough counterparts to the ones they're using. We can use those as kind of bridges to get close to what their concepts are. So he climbs up the ladder, and then the metaphor can go two different ways, right? It can be that either that he stays stuck on the ladder, sort of roughly at the level with the hut, and he sort of watches them, and he doesn't quite get to their concepts, doesn't quite get to their propositions and the rest of it, doesn't quite understand. But he's very close. I mean, he's got really close. Or the metaphor could be, no, he steps off. And so he's got exactly the same place, understands like they do, but by a different route. He may not share everything. He may not share the actual convictions, but he will understand the convictions. He will understand the concepts without remainder. And indeed, he may often do so better. Somebody like Malinowski, for example, who was, he was the man who coined the slogan, "No language, no penetration." He was a great linguist. And he really, did it very scrupulously, spent long times with the Trobriand Islanders, and probably had much better powers of observation, much more incentive to observe carefully than the average native did. And so you might even say, he probably understands even better than they do. We often have imperfect understandings of our own culture's concepts and propositions and so on. So that would be the alternative. So my question to you is really, a lot of what you said sounded like we're still stuck on the ladder. Yeah. And isn't that really wrong? Because, to put it another way, isn't understanding, for example, ultimately a matter of mastery of the use of words and so on in a context? And aren't there different routes by which we can get to that?
Good. So I'm still thinking about this, and I know it's something we've spoken about a lot, but the reason why in my account it sounds like we're still stuck on the ladder is just because I want to emphasize the practice of building and walking across the ladder, because that's the piece of the deeply engaged person's work that the absolutist and universalist need to understand in order to see that her account, at least on its own terms, maybe not on their terms, but it's on its own terms, is coherent. So the point that we need for the coherence of relativism is that walking across the ladder. As far as, do we, how deeply can we penetrate into another way of life? Is a total conversion possible? I think that whichever way I answer that question, it won't, you could disagree with me on this, but as far as I can see, it won't, I think it won't change whether my account of relativism works, because I'm not constructing it on this sort of on a sort of incommensurability by inability to penetrate another way of life. I'm grounding it on this idea of entrenched conflict and a rich kind of disagreement. So I think either way that I resolve it, whether I say, you can get there, you can, but in that case, I'd want to call it a total conversion, right? It's not that you jumped out of all ways of life or that you employed some non-relativistic tools. You just managed to effect a complete conversion through this process. And maybe you can flip back and forth and jump between the different ways of life, but I don't think that those abilities really give you something that makes problems for the sort of relativist account that I'm offering. Although I do tend, if you ask me what my personal preferences are, I think even the fact that someone who's not from the culture goes into it and understands it better, sometimes the person who learns English as a second language ends up speaking it more articulately than the English speaker, the native speaker, etc. I think even that's a kind of sign of non-nativeness. But I think in the end it doesn't change my account whether I say, you can undergo a full and seamless conversion or not. So. Yeah,
this word conversion, I think, is tricky.
Integration.
I took you to be interested, and I was interested in understanding. Really.
Yeah.
Not in adopting the values, not in adopting the beliefs, in understanding without remainder.
Yeah. Okay.
And
sorry.
now, you might come back at me if when I say that and say, well, you can't fully understand without having a system of beliefs that constitutes or partially constitutes the understanding. So actually conversion is not a misleading notion to use, because you actually do have to take on a lot of beliefs, perhaps including value beliefs, in order to achieve the understanding. But there's an alternative to that, which is something like, there's a connected system of propositions. You have to be able to find your way around them, know how they relate.
And you don't have to convert.
But you don't actually have to embrace them.
Right.
Yes. So for example, the intuitionist mathematician can perfectly well understand the classical mathematician and vice versa, because they both understand how all of the axioms and theorems sort of differ in the two cases, and how they relate to the constants that are affected in meaning. and so they can
Yeah.
understand the terms, but it doesn't mean that they actually embrace.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm sorry about that because I didn't mean to imply that to merge the distinction between understanding and endorsement. So, and the use of the word conversion probably suggested that. So I'm sorry about that.
Thanks. No, anyway, that was great. So let's thank Alyssa and then take a little break.
Thank you.